Before we start writing code, I'm going to go over the user stories. The summary for this project was already covered in the slides, but it's here for reference in case you need it. Down here in the user stories, we're going to start at stage 1. So the first part of stage 1 reads, I want to add bills, including the name and amount owed. And the second part of stage 1 reads, I want to view existing bills. Before we can even start with stage 1, we're going to need to create a support function for managing user input. So I'm just going to create a single function, and that's going to be the one used for all user input by all of the menus. I'm going to call my function getInput, and it's just going to return an optional string. Within this function, I'm going to create a mutable buffer to hold the input. So we'll create a new string here. And then I'm just going to loop over the input. So if the user does something wrong or if there's an error in the terminal, then it's just going to loop over and over again until we finally get some valid data. So we can use the input-output module and then grab the standard input and then call the readLine function on it. We're going to hand the mutable buffer to the readLine function, which will populate it with the data that is from the terminal. If we get an error, we're just going to print out a message. Please enter your data again. The next thing we're going to do is trim off the white space on the terminal entry. So what happens here in the readLine function right here, when the user presses enter, there's going to be a new line at the end. So we want to get rid of that. So we're going to do that by using trim. So we'll create a new variable. We'll just take the buffer, we'll trim off any white space, and we'll turn it into an owned string by using the toOwned function. Now, if the input is empty, we're just going to return none. So we'll return none if the input is empty. That would mean the user didn't enter anything at all. They just hit enter. And we'll kind of classify that as an exit input. And if they enter anything else, we'll just return it. So we'll put it into a sum, and then we'll have the input to work with. So here's the entire function for getting user input. We return an optional string. First thing we do is create a buffer. We have an infinite loop here that will go until the user enters anything valid. If there's an error, they're going to get this message printed out, and they'll have to try again. We take the input, and we trim off any white spaces, and turn it into an owned string because we're working with an owned string here. And if the input has nothing in it, we'll just return none. Otherwise, we'll just return the input. This function should suffice for getting all user input in the program. So the next video, we're going to cover how to create the main menu loop.